A CEO's arrogant laughter echoes inside a first-class cabin when he publicly belittles a black woman. Passengers watch in uneasy silence, some smirking, some shrinking. Yet beneath her quiet presence lies a calm force that unsettles him. The chapter ends with a sharp cliffhanger, hinting at the revelation that will flip their worlds. "We don't sit next to people like you." The words cut through the hush of the boarding process like a slap. First-class passengers, already adjusting, their seatbelts and sipping complimentary champagne, turned their heads. A few smirked behind raised glasses. Others looked down, pretending not to hear. The air, scented with leather upholstery and faint citrus cleaner, grew heavier with the weight of arrogance. The man who had spoken was unmistakable. Richard Halden, CEO of Halden Dynamics, a towering figure in tailored navy suit and polished cufflinks, the kind of man who made space feel too small around him. His laugh was booming, practiced, the laugh of a man who knew the world bent for him. He had turned to the woman placing her carry-on into the overhead bin. She was black, mid-30s, slim but commanding in her quiet way, dressed in a cream blouse and slate skirt. No designer logos, no flashy jewelry, only composure. She didn't flinch at his words. Her eyes, dark and steady, reflected something beyond patience. A quiet storm. Passengers shifted in their seats. A young couple whispered. An elderly man adjusted his newspaper, choosing silence over defense. The flight attendants glanced at each other, then back at the CEO. No one moved. Richard leaned back in his plush leather seat, one arm sprawled across the armrest as though he owned it. "First class is for people who can afford to matter," he added, his voice dripping disdain. His assistant seated across the aisle chuckled softly, complicit in the insult. The woman slid her bag into place and with a graceful motion clicked. The compartment shut. Her symbolic action was small but deliberate, a kind of finality, as though sealing away not just her belongings, but the weight of his ignorance. She turned, faced him fully, and for the first time spoke. Her voice was calm, velvet over steel. "Then I suppose you've never traveled with dignity, Mr. Halden." A ripple ran through the cabin. Some passengers stiffened, others lowered their eyes. Richard's smirk faltered, but only for a heartbeat before his arrogance refueled him. He barked a laugh, loud enough to reclaim control. "Oh, you know my name," he said, voice booming again. "Impressive. But names won't change where you belong." He tapped the armrest with a jeweled finger. "And it isn't here." She sat down beside him anyway, unhurried, her posture unbroken. She fastened her seatbelt with the kind of elegance that mocked his rage without a single word. For a moment she closed her eyes, shutting out the staring eyes around her. Inside her chest, her heartbeat was steady. She had endured worse than sneers on an airplane. Yet she could feel the tremor in the room. Not her own, but his. Power, disguised as confidence, had cracks, and cracks widened when touched with calm truth. The captain's voice broke the tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be departing shortly. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened." But the cabin wasn't listening. Not really. Every soul was still hanging on the quiet battle unfolding in seat 2A. Richard leaned closer, his voice a hiss meant only for her. "If you think you'll silence me with one clever line, you're mistaken. You don't belong in my world, not in business, not in power, not even on this flight." Her eyes opened again, unwavering. She tilted her head just enough to meet his gaze without fear. "Then maybe it's time you learned that the world doesn't belong to you." That line, low, calm, immovable, slid into the air like a blade. Froze. For half a second, Richard Halden looked like a man glimpsing a shadow too large to name. Then he covered it with another laugh, louder this time, forced. The plane began its taxi, engines humming, passengers glued to the invisible stage. The air hummed with an energy thicker than turbulence. No one spoke, yet everyone knew. This flight was about to reveal something far more turbulent than weather. The woman adjusted her seatbelt once more, almost casually, as though preparing, not just for takeoff, but for something greater. She whispered, not to him, not to anyone, just to the silence. "Let's see how high you can fly when the ground shifts." The engines roared. The plane lifted, and with it came the unshakable sense that Richard Halden had just boarded a journey far more dangerous than he realized. The cliffhanger hung in the cabin like static. Who exactly was this woman? The cabin. Lights dimmed to a soft golden hue as the plane reached cruising altitude. First-class passengers adjusted their seats, some already pulling out laptops, others stretching under cashmere blankets. The low hum of engines filled the air like a steady drumbeat. Yet even at 30,000 feet, the tension in row 2 clung like smoke. Richard Halden, glass of bourbon in hand, leaned back as though the cabin were his personal boardroom. He exuded the confidence of a man too accustomed to applause, even when the audience sat in strained silence. His assistant, a thin man with slicked hair and anxious eyes, dutifully chuckled at every remark, desperate to mirror his boss's arrogance. The woman beside Richard had not moved much since takeoff. She sat poised, hands folded gently on her lap, her eyes fixed on the clouds streaking past the window. Her silence was louder than his laughter. Richard glanced sideways, irritation prickling his composure. "So," he said, swirling the bourbon, as though addressing a subordinate, "what line of work do you claim to be in? Fashion retail? Or maybe, you look like you could do well in customer service." The assistant snorted, too eagerly. She didn't turn to face him. Her gaze remained on the vast expanse of sky, pale blue against the curve of the horizon. "I'm in leadership," she said simply. Richard barked another laugh. "Leadership? That's rich." He leaned forward, his cologne sharp in the air. "There's a difference between leading and following orders. Some of us are born to lead, others to obey. Don't confuse the two." Her lips curved, just faintly. Not a smile, but the shadow of one. "And some of us learn that true leaders don't need to remind people they're in charge." A murmur rippled across the cabin. A woman in pearls lowered her novel to listen. A businessman paused mid-sentence on his laptop. No one dared intervene, but every eye flicked between them as if watching a silent play unfold. Richard shifted in his seat, his laugh sharper now. "You have a sharp tongue for someone sitting in my shadow. Do you know how many people would kill to have 5 minutes of my time? How many beg for the chance to pitch to me?" Her voice was soft, but it carried. "And yet here you are, begging for my attention." That line pierced deeper than he expected. He pressed his lips together, swirling his bourbon harder as though the amber liquid might calm the sudden knot in his chest. The silence stretched. The engines hummed. Somewhere behind them, a child giggled, unaware of the battle in row 2. Richard broke the quiet again, louder this time. "You know what separates me from people like you? Vision, drive. I built my empire from nothing. I didn't wait for handouts. I didn't ask for equality. I demanded victory." For the first time, she turned from the window to face him fully. Her eyes were steady, unreadable, like dark glass hiding storms. "And in all your victories," she asked, "how many people did you trample to feel tall?" He blinked. His assistant froze, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. The passengers held their breath. Richard recovered with a scoff. "Trample? That's business. Winners win, losers whine." Her gaze didn't waver. Or maybe losers laugh the loudest, trying to convince themselves they've won. For the briefest moment, Richard's hand trembled around his glass. He steadied it quickly, but the flicker was noticed. His mask of dominance cracked, not enough to fall, but enough to show weakness. The flight attendant appeared, tray balanced with fresh drinks. Her eyes darted between them nervously. "Would either of you care for—" "No," Richard snapped, waving her off as though dismissing a servant. "We're having a conversation." The woman's voice softened again, almost tender. "No, Mr. Halden, you're having a performance. I'm simply waiting for the curtain to fall." The words slid into the air like prophecy. The attendant hesitated, then moved on. A few passengers exchanged glances. They couldn't name it yet, but the energy in the room was shifting. Richard Halden, the man who never lost control, was grasping too hard at it. He tried one last jab, leaning so close his cufflinks gleamed in the golden light. Let me give you advice, since clearly you've never had the privilege of hearing it from someone successful. Stay in your lane, know your place. People who overreach always end up crashing back down. She held his gaze. Without blinking, her reply was calm, precise, inevitable. And people who climb too high on broken backs eventually find the ground isn't there to catch them. The words hit him harder than turbulence. His jaw clenched. His assistant shifted uncomfortably, suddenly too warm in the cabin, but she didn't look at either of them again. She turned back to the window, to the clouds, to the quiet. Her silence once again became her greatest weapon. Around them, passengers carried on their small tasks, pretending to read, pretending to sleep, but no one could escape the feeling that they were watching something historic, something more than a spat on a flight. Richard leaned back, sipping, his bourbon harder, his laughter gone, and though he didn't know it yet, every word he had thrown at her had only sharpened the fall he was heading toward. The seatbelt sign dimmed, and the flight attendants moved quietly through the aisle, serving meals with forced smiles. Silverware clinked. Napkins unfolded, the scent of roasted chicken and buttered rolls drifting through first class. But all eyes, even when averted, remained fixed on row 2. Richard Halden, restless in his seat, had grown bolder with every sip of bourbon. His arrogance wasn't subtle, it was loud, theatrical, meant to remind everyone of who he believed he was. He gestured with wide sweeps of his hand, his voice carrying just enough to fill the cabin. You know, he announced, not directly to her but to the room at large. People like this always talk about leadership. 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 It's a word they love to toss around without earning it. Truth is, there's a difference between managing pity projects and running a billion-dollar empire. His assistant chuckled obligingly. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to laugh or to hide. Most chose silence. The woman beside him continued cutting her food with steady hands, unhurried, her posture unshaken. She hadn't even glanced at him. That lack of acknowledgement gnawed at him worse than an argument. He craved resistance to validate his superiority, but her silence made him small. He leaned closer, lowering his voice, though still loud enough for others to catch. Tell me, what's the biggest thing you've ever managed? A charity bake sale? Maybe a diversity panel? The words were sharp, meant to slice, but they landed against her calm like pebbles against stone. She set down her fork and dabbed her mouth with the napkin. Then she turned to him, eyes steady, voice serene. Mr. Halden, I manage myself. That's something you've never mastered. The line cut deeper than laughter could. A murmur flickered across the cabin. Someone coughed, covering a chuckle. Richard's jaw tightened. You think you're clever, don't you? She tilted her head slightly. No, I think I'm patient. The way she said it, gentle, deliberate, turned the word into a blade. Richard tried to rally. He lifted his glass, signaling the flight attendant. Another drink, and bring her one too. Something sweet. Maybe she'll learn to smile. The attendant hesitated, eyes darting between them, before obeying with quiet reluctance. When the fresh drinks arrived, Richard raised his glass high. To ambition without reality, he declared loudly, may it always entertain those of us who actually matter. No one clinked glasses with him. His assistant forced a grin, but kept his glass low. The woman lifted her water calmly, holding it steady in the light. To reality without arrogance, she said softly, and took a sip. The air shifted. It was subtle, but palpable. More passengers now leaned ever so slightly, toward her side. Richard felt it, the change in weight, the way attention bent toward her instead of him. His laugh rang out again, but this time it was brittle, almost hollow. Don't mistake silence for support, he snapped at the watching cabin. These people know I'm right. They know what it takes to be in this seat. Her reply came, without pause. Yes, and they see exactly what you've done with it. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Even the hum of the engine seemed muted, as if the plane itself were listening. Richard swallowed hard, though he masked it with another sip. His assistant avoided eye contact. A woman across the aisle closed her book and simply watched. The black woman turned back to her meal, unbothered, as though the exchange had cost her nothing. But inside she felt the shift. The performance he staged was no longer for dominance, it was for survival. Richard tapped his fingers against the armrest, too fast, betraying nerves he didn't want to admit. He spoke again, but now it was only for himself. Respect isn't given, it's taken. Remember that. She set down her glass and looked at him one final time. Her words were measured, soft enough that only those nearest would hear, but sharp enough to pierce. Respect isn't taken, Mr. Halden. It's reflected, and right now you're only staring into emptiness. His hand froze mid-tap. His assistant glanced down at his own shoes. Passengers went quiet, some lowering their heads, others staring openly now. The cabin had shifted fully, without anyone speaking it. The balance of dignity had tilted. Richard forced himself into his seat, jaw tight, fingers white around the armrest. His silence for once was heavier than hers. And though he sat high above the clouds, Richard Halden had never felt so close to falling. The seatbelt light pinged back on with a soft chime, followed by the captain's voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering a patch of turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated." Almost on cue, the plane jolted, silverware rattling on trays, glasses trembling in their holders. Passengers stiffened, some clutching armrests. The steady hum of engines now felt edged with unease. Richard Halden smirked, though his hand gripped the armrest harder than he intended. "Figures," he muttered, loud enough for his neighbors to hear. "Storms always follow me, but I don't scare easy." The woman beside him calmly refastened her seatbelt, her movements fluid, unbothered. Her eyes never left the horizon beyond. The window, where streaks of clouds darkened against a bruised sky. Richard turned toward her, a grin stretched too wide across his face. "What about you? This your first time in first class? Maybe turbulence is unsettling for someone who doesn't belong here." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Turbulence unsettles those who think they control the sky," the FI. Plane shook again, harder this time. A gasp escaped from somewhere in the cabin. Richard laughed sharply, masking his nerves with bravado. "Control is everything. That's why people like me run the world, while people like you observe it." Her reply came like a whisper carried on the storm. "People like me weather it." The words landed with the weight of prophecy. Another jolt sent his bourbon glass sliding, amber liquid spilling across his tray. The assistant fumbled with napkins, dabbing frantically, his nervousness amplifying the humiliation. Richard cursed, under his breath too loudly, drawing glances. "Ridiculous service," he barked at a passing flight attendant. "Can't even keep a drink steady." The attendant froze, eyes wide, then scurried away. The passengers were watching now, not the turbulence, but him. His anger looked childish against the calm of the woman beside him. She picked up her own water, holding it steady despite the shaking plane, and took a sip with grace. Then she set it down gently, not a drop spilled. The contrast was undeniable. Richard's laugh came again, forced, brittle. "Luck, that's all it is. Some people are lucky, others earn their place." Her gaze drifted over him, quiet but piercing. "And some mistake privilege for earning." The silence that followed was louder than the turbulence. Passengers exchanged glances, the truth of her words sinking into the shared air. Richard shifted in his seat, running a hand over his tie as though to tighten his grip on control. His assistant avoided looking at him entirely, staring instead at the floor. The plane jolted once more, sending overhead compartments creaking. A child whimpered in the back. The woman closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing in and out, embodying stillness even as the world shook. Richard noticed. He sneered. "Meditating? Praying? Hoping the storm spares you?" Her eyes opened again, steady and calm. "No. I'm remembering that storms pass. Arrogance doesn't." A ripple of hushed laughter escaped from a nearby row before being quickly stifled. Richard's face reddened. He leaned closer, voice low and sharp. "You think you've won something here? You haven't. These people respect me. They always will. You're just—" He stopped himself, his words caught between fury and restraint. She tilted her head. "Just what?" The question hung heavy. He had the chance to reveal himself completely, to drop the final mask and show the raw prejudice beneath. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way the passengers were watching. Perhaps it was the quiet power radiating from her. He swallowed the word he wanted to say. Instead, he leaned back with a huff, muttering, "You wouldn't understand. People like you never do." Her voice came like steel wrapped in silk. "And yet here you are trying to make me." The turbulence eased, the plane settling back into smoother skies. The seatbelt light blinked off. Passengers exhaled in relief, though the tension in row 2 remained unbroken. Richard adjusted his tie again, his face slick with a sheen of sweat he tried to hide. His laughter no longer filled the cabin. His silence, jagged and heavy, did. The woman returned her gaze to the window, the storm behind them fading into sunlight. But inside the cabin, another storm had only begun. One Richard could no longer outrun. And for the first time he knew it. The storm had passed, but the storm inside row 2 had not. The plane cruised smoothly now, but Richard Halden's pulse beat erratically, his mind searching for a new weapon. Mockery hadn't worked. Silence had backfired. Even the turbulence hadn't rattled her composure, so he reached for the one thing he believed no one could ignore: power. He leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, his eyes narrowing. "You know, I've built more than just a company," he said, voice lower now, darker. "I've built influence, connections. Judges answer my calls, senators owe me favors, people vanish from entire industries with one word from me." He glanced sideways at her, waiting for the flicker of fear. None came. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her blouse and looked at him. "And yet here you are trying to convince me." The words landed like a pebble into a pond, rippling across the cabin. A man 2 rows ahead coughed into his hand as though covering a smile. Richard's jaw tightened. "You think this is funny? Do you understand what I can do to someone like you?" Her voice was calm, but it carried. "Someone like me? Or someone who doesn't bow?" His assistant shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the passengers who were clearly listening. Richard ignored him, leaning closer, his voice sharpening. "I could end your career with a single call. Whatever job you think you're proud of, it's gone. Whatever reputation you think you've built, it's ashes. You'd be blacklisted, invisible." Her gaze didn't falter. She leaned in slightly, her words so soft they cut sharper than his threat. "A man who can end things so easily has clearly never built anything real." The silence afterward was crushing. Richard's fingers drummed against the armrest, too fast, betraying nerves he desperately wanted to hide. He looked around at the passengers, seeking support, but their eyes avoided his. They were no longer his audience. They were her witnesses. He forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "You don't get it. I'm untouchable. People worship the ground I walk on. I can buy loyalty, respect, silence." She tilted her head. "And do they follow you because they believe in you or because they fear you?" The question was a scalpel. His assistant swallowed hard, adjusting his tie. Richard's voice grew louder, almost shouting. "Fear works. That's why I win. That's why I'm in this seat. That's why people like you stay where you are." Her reply was quiet, deliberate, unshaken. "No, Mr. Halden. That's why you've already lost." The words were spoken so gently that they struck harder than any shout. Passengers shifted. One woman across the aisle closed her laptop, openly watching now. The cabin had transformed into a silent courtroom, and every word was testimony. Richard tried again, desperation creeping in. "Do you know how many people have begged for my mentorship? How many careers I've launched? I made them, and I could unmake you with less effort than it takes to blink." She placed her hands together, fingers interlaced, resting on her lap. "If you made them, then they were never strong enough to stand without you. That's not leadership, that's dependency. That's weakness disguised as power." Her words echoed in the hush. Even the engines seemed quieter, as though the plane itself had leaned closer to hear. Richard felt sweat bead on his forehead. He loosened his tie, trying to appear casual, but the movement betrayed discomfort. His assistant wiped his palms on his trousers, trapped in the second-hand embarrassment of a collapsing throne. "Careful," Richard hissed, his voice low now. "You don't know who you're talking to." Her eyes locked onto his, steady, unwavering. "No, Mr. Halden, you don't know who you're talking to." For a heartbeat, his laughter tried to return, but it stuck in his throat. He swallowed. Hard. Leaning back, feigning indifference, though the cracks were showing. Passengers exchanged glances, some with faint smiles, others with widened eyes. Slowly, silently, the balance of the cabin was shifting entirely. Richard Halden, the man who had always controlled the room, no longer owned the air around him. His threats, once his sharpest weapon, now sounded like a child's bluff. And beside him, the woman's silence grew heavier, her dignity louder than his noise. She picked up her glass of water, took another measured sip, and set it down gently. Then, without looking at him, she spoke a single line that hollowed him out more than anything before. "Power that needs to be spoken isn't power at all." Richard Halden didn't reply. Couldn't reply. The cabin knew it. And as the plane soared across the night sky, the first cracks in his empire widened into something he could no longer control. The cabin had settled into a muted quiet. Trays cleared, lights dimmed, passengers slipped into half-sleep or the pretense of it. But in row 2, the tension had only sharpened, humming like a taut string ready to snap. Richard Halden leaned toward the woman, his bourbon-scented breath sharp in the air. His voice, though lowered, still carried the edge of command. "Enough with the clever little comebacks. Let's talk reality. Where are you from?" She didn't look at him. Her eyes traced the endless black of the night sky beyond the window. "From where I was born," she answered simply. Richard scoffed. "Don't get smart. I mean, what neighborhood? What family? Because I can tell you right now, people like me don't come from wherever you came from." She turned her head slightly, just enough to meet his gaze. "People like you often forget where they came from at all." The words landed like a slap, quiet but undeniable. His assistant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, eyes darting between them. Richard's smile thinned into something closer to a snarl. "So you're not going to answer? Typical. Hiding. Pretending. Always trying to sound above your station when you can't even name it." She tilted her head, voice soft. "And what station do you believe I should claim, Mr. Halden?" Her calmness infuriated him. He raised his voice loud enough for others to hear. "The truth, don't play games. People like you always try to rewrite your story, cover it up with fake polish. But you can't run from who you are. You probably went to some second-rate school, worked some low-level job, climbed by begging for handouts. Am I close?" A woman across the aisle lowered her headphones, staring at him in disbelief. The man beside her shook his head faintly. The black woman, however, did not flinch. "You're not close at all," she said, her tone level, almost kind. "But keep guessing. It reveals more about you than it does about me." His laugh came again, sharp and forced. "Oh, that's rich. You think you're above this? Above me? Please. I've sat on boards, signed deals worth more than you'll see in your lifetime. You don't intimidate me." Her eyes softened, almost pitying. "I don't need to intimidate you, you're already afraid." The silence after that was heavier than the roar of the engines. Richard's assistant cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, maybe—" "Quiet," Richard snapped, silencing him instantly. He turned back to her, pressing harder now, as though interrogation might restore his slipping control. "Tell me, what's your net worth? What company could you possibly run? Who even knows your name? Because in my world, names matter. Influence matters. And I've never heard of you." She smiled faintly for the first time, not wide, Not mocking, just the quiet smile of someone who knew something he didn't. That says more about the size of your world than the size of mine. Several passengers shifted, some exchanging glances of approval, others smirking behind their hands. The balance of sympathy had shifted entirely. Richard leaned back, his face flushed, sweat glistening under the dim lights. He grabbed another napkin, dabbing at his forehead as though the cabin air had grown too warm. His laugh came hollow, bouncing off the walls with no echo. "You really think these people are on your side?" he hissed. "They're silent because they know better. They respect power. They respect me. You're just entertainment." Her voice was gentle but firm. "No, Mr. Halden. They're silent because they've seen enough." The truth of it hung in the air, undeniable. Richard tried again, softer this time, almost pleading. "So who are you then? Some professor? A non-profit worker? A mid-level manager who lucked into a ticket? Because whatever mask you're wearing, it won't hold up under real scrutiny." She folded her hands in her lap, her composure unshaken. "Scrutiny only breaks masks, Mr. Halden. It never breaks the face beneath." For the first time, he had no reply. His mouth opened, then closed, his usual quips gone. The silence pressed harder than any insult. The passengers, once avoiding eye contact, now watched openly, some with quiet admiration, others with quiet disgust directed at him. The cabin was no longer neutral ground, it was a stage, and he had lost the script. She returned her gaze to the window, her calmness absolute. "The night sky is vast, Mr. Halden. Bigger than your empire, bigger than your ego. And when morning comes, we'll both still be here. Let's see whose shadow it favors." Richard swallowed, shifting in his seat, his reflection faintly visible, in the window beside hers. For the first time in years, he saw not a king, but a man. And though he didn't yet know her truth, he felt the edges of it pressing closer, inevitable as dawn. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice suddenly rang out, far too loud for the hushed cabin. "Can we all agree that we're being subjected to the most absurd little performance?" Heads turned reluctantly. A few earbuds came out, tablets lowered, pillows shifted. He spread his arms as if addressing an audience in a boardroom. His cufflinks caught the dim light, glittering like trophies. "Here we are halfway to New York, and somehow this—" He gestured to the woman beside him with an exaggerated sweep. "Thinks she's entitled to play Queen of the Skies." The black woman didn't move. She sat with the same quiet dignity, eyes forward, hands folded. Richard forced a laugh, sharp and hollow. "You'd think with her attitude she owned the airline. I mean, really. Can you believe this?" Silence. Scanned the cabin, his smile stretched too tight. "Come on, don't just stare. Somebody's got to agree with me, right?" No one spoke. A woman near the aisle tugged her blanket higher around her shoulders. The man beside her shifted away, from Richard's gaze. Across the row, a teenager pretended to look out the window, though his earbuds weren't even plugged in. Richard's laugh grew louder, desperate. "Oh, don't be shy. I know you see it. This arrogance. This entitlement. Acting like she's above me, above us all." Still, silence. The black woman finally turned her head, her calm eyes meeting his. She didn't say a word. He hated it. Hated how her stillness seemed stronger than his roar. Richard straightened his jacket, addressing the passengers again. "Maybe you don't know who I am. Richard Halden, CEO, billionaire. I've been on the cover of Forbes twice. Twice. My signature has built companies, saved economies. People fly to me begging for meetings, and yet here I am, treated like a fool." The silence deepened. In the back, someone coughed quietly. A stewardess walked briskly down the aisle, deliberately not meeting his eyes. He gestured at the black woman again. "She won't even say who she is, won't give a name, a title, nothing, just stares at me, smug. Tell me that's not ridiculous. Tell me I'm not the only sane person on this plane." No one answered. He tried laughter again, but it cracked. His assistant shifted beside him, whispering urgently, "Sir, maybe just let it go." "Let it go?" Richard snapped. "No, That's the problem with people these days. They let it go. They let imposters nobodies walk around pretending to be somebody. Well, not on my watch. The woman finally spoke, her voice steady. On your watch, Mr. Halden, or under your shadow? The words slid like ice under his skin. He barked back. Don't twist this. I'm not the villain here. He turned again, to the rows of watching eyes. Am I? Am I? A businessman near the back adjusted his glasses but said nothing. A mother hushed her child, glancing at him with disdain. The silence became suffocating, like a courtroom where the verdict had already been delivered. Richard felt sweat pooling under his collar. His smile faltered, replaced by a twitch of the mouth. He spread his hands again, his voice higher, thinner. Fine, fine. Pretend you don't see it. Pretend you're not thinking exactly what I am. But you are. You all are. You're just too afraid to say it. The woman's gaze held him, like a mirror. Afraid or unwilling to follow? The words cracked him open. He faltered, blinking at her, then at the passengers. Faces blank, silent. Some sympathetic toward her, some hostile toward him, but none on his side. It hit him then, heavier than any insult. His kingdom of influence, his empire of fear and respect, held no currency here. His voice, usually magnetic, commanding, persuasive, now rang hollow against walls that refused to echo it back. For the first time in years, Richard Halden realized he was speaking only to himself. He slumped back in his seat, his fists curling, jaw clenching, eyes fixed on the dark horizon outside. The black woman whispered, barely audible but sharp as glass. The silence says enough, and it had. The cabin seemed to grow quieter with every mile. Even the engines, steady and powerful, faded beneath the roar inside Richard Halden's head. He sat back, jaw locked, eyes fixed on nothing. The silence from the passengers still echoed like a verdict. He had reached for them, demanded their loyalty, and instead they had offered him nothing. Nothing. That word burned worse than mockery. His assistant sat stiff beside him, staring at his folded hands, not daring to speak. The black woman, calm as ever, stared out the window as though he didn't exist. And that, more than anything, gnawed at him. She didn't fight him. She didn't lash back. She didn't even grant him the dignity of being her opponent. Her silence was not weakness, it was dismissal. Richard's chest tightened. Dismissal was something he could not bear. He had spent his life building walls of reputation, towers of wealth, fortresses of influence, structures so high that no one dared dismiss him. Until now. His mind wandered, unbidden, to a memory. He was 16, standing on a cracked sidewalk, the sound of boys' laughter ringing in his ears. He had worn the wrong shoes, the cheap pair from a discount bin, and they had mocked him for it. He remembered swearing that day he would never be small again. Never mocked, never dismissed. But here he was, decades later, and the sting felt the same. He shifted in his seat, tugging at his tie. His breath came uneven, shallow. His reflection in the window looked distorted, warped by the curve of the glass. He didn't see the polished CEO. He saw the boy again, red-faced, helpless, desperate to prove his worth. His thoughts snapped back to the present as he glanced at her. She hadn't moved. Her stillness was maddening, like a mountain that refused to acknowledge the storm beating against it. He wanted to break it, to provoke her into something, anything, anger, insult, even a shout. Anything would be better than that impenetrable calm. But he didn't speak. He couldn't. The weight of the cabin pressed down, and for the first time he feared what might come out if he opened his mouth. He thought of his empire, his offices in glass towers, his name printed in magazines, the photographs of him shaking hands with men who had once ruled nations. All of it felt suddenly fragile, as though one wrong word, one wrong moment could shatter it. And then came another memory, his father's voice booming across a dinner table. Never let them see you small, Richard. Small men get trampled. You were born to be bigger, louder, harder, always. Richard had lived by those words. Every deal, every meeting, every confrontation, he had dominated, spoken over, crushed resistance. That was how he survived. That was how he won. But now, sitting beside this woman, he felt those words unravel. Because she had shown him something terrifying. Control didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it didn't speak at all. His chest tightened again, a dull ache spreading through his ribs. He reached for another napkin, dabbing his forehead. His hand trembled faintly, and he clenched it into a fist to hide it. He glanced again at the passengers. Their silence hadn't changed. They weren't with him. They weren't against him, they were simply gone from his side. He had become noise they no longer wished to hear. Noise. The word cut deeper than he expected. The woman shifted slightly, just enough to fold her arms, her gaze still fixed outward. And somehow, that small movement pierced him more than any insult. He wanted to ask her, "Who are you? Why do you sit there so calm? Why does your silence undo me?" But pride sealed his lips. Instead, he closed his eyes, leaning back into the headrest. In the darkness behind his eyelids, the memories came faster now. Deals where he had crushed opponents with glee, meetings where he had silenced voices with a single sneer, faces that had looked at him not with respect but with quiet fear. And for the first time he wondered, had they all been silent not because they admired him, but because they pitied him? Or worse, because they saw through him? His throat tightened. He swallowed hard, forcing the thought down, burying it. Arrogance was the armor he had always worn. Without it, what was he? The engines hummed, steady as ever. The flight attendant passed quietly, setting a fresh glass of water on the table beside the black woman. She thanked her softly, her voice a melody against the oppressive stillness. Richard's eyes flicked open. That simple exchange, polite, warm, dignified, felt like another blade to his armor. He reached for his bourbon, but his hand shook. The glass clinked against the tray, a betraying sound. He pressed it down, forcing his grip steady. He took a slow sip, but it did nothing to settle the storm. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Halden felt small again. And though he tried to bury it under pride, under rage, under the fortress of his wealth, he knew the cracks had begun to spread. The black woman's reflection glimmered beside his in the window, calm, still, unshaken, and in her calm, he saw the mirror he had avoided all his life. Richard Halden could feel the eyes. Not the admiring eyes he was used to, those of investors, journalists, and underlings desperate to please him, but eyes heavy with disapproval, with pity. It burned worse than any flame. He tugged at his tie, loosened it, then tightened it again. His skin felt hot, his throat dry. The bourbon only made it worse. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, speaking not just to the woman beside him, but to anyone who would listen. "Look, you don't understand. I built everything I have from nothing. Nothing. You think money was handed to me? You think I didn't fight, bleed, sacrifice? While others sat around waiting for handouts, I clawed my way up." No one replied. The silence stretched until it was unbearable. He gestured wildly, his voice rising. "I earned this. Every dollar, every headline, every deal with my name stamped on it. I earned it. Do you hear me?" The man 2 rows ahead shifted in his seat, deliberately turning his back. A woman across the aisle slipped on her headphones, shutting him out. Even his assistant sat rigid, eyes down, as though praying to disappear. "Richards," voice cracked, "don't turn away from me, don't you dare. You think I care what you think? I don't need you, I don't need any of you." Still, no one looked at him. The black woman remained silent, her eyes on the window, her reflection a serene shadow beside his distorted one. He slammed his hand against the armrest. The sound jolted the passengers, but no one spoke. The flight attendant glanced over, cautious, then disappeared quickly behind the curtain. Richard turned to the woman at last, desperation leaking through the cracks of his rage. "And you, what's your game?" sitting there like you're above it all. Too good to answer me. Too good to even say your name. She turned her head slowly, her gaze steady, unflinching. You've spoken enough names tonight, Mr. Halden. All of them your own. Her calm words sliced deeper than any insult. Richard blinked, caught off guard, his mouth opening but no sound coming out. He had built an empire of words, boasts, threats, commands, but now they failed him. The passengers watched, not with the tension of fear anymore, but with the quiet certainty that something irreversible was happening. Richard tried again, weaker, this time. I've done more than anyone here. I've earned respect. You can't just sit there and dismiss me like I'm no one. Her eyes softened. Respect cannot be demanded, Mr. Halden, it is revealed. And tonight everyone sees. The words echoed in the silence, undeniable. Richard's shoulders slumped, his breath uneven. He glanced, around desperately searching for a sympathetic glance but found none. Not even his assistant would meet his eyes. He laughed suddenly, the sound high, brittle, broken. This is ridiculous. All of you, sitting there, judging me. You don't know what it takes to be me. You don't know the weight I carry. The woman's voice was soft but firm. The heaviest weight is the mask you refuse to remove. His breath hitched. It was as if she had reached into his chest and pulled the truth he had spent decades hiding. He gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles pale. His empire, his reputation, his identity. It all felt as though it were slipping through his fingers, grain by grain. Finally, she leaned closer, her tone calm yet commanding. You want to know my name, don't you? You've demanded it since the beginning. Richard's eyes snapped to hers, desperate. Yes, who are you? The passengers leaned in, the tension vibrating through the cabin. She gave the faintest smile. You'll know soon enough. And then she turned back to the window, leaving him and everyone else hanging in silence. Richard's chest heaved. The boy inside him, the one mocked for his cheap shoes, screamed for validation. But the man he had become sat frozen, knowing that the answer she held could destroy him completely. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane pressed on through the night. The hush was no longer his ally. It was hers. And though no one yet knew her truth, the weight of it already crushed him. The plane had grown impossibly still. Passengers leaned in subtly, eyes fixed on row 2. They sensed it, the tension, the inevitability of something about to break. Richard Halden sat slumped, the bourbon gone, his tie crooked, sweat dampening the collar of his expensive shirt. His empire had always traveled with him like armor, but here, at 30,000 feet, he looked stripped bare. The black woman shifted at last, unfolding her arms with a grace that made even the simple act seem deliberate. She turned her head, her eyes steady, unblinking. You've demanded my name, Mr. Halden, she said softly, yet her voice carried like a bell. Perhaps it's time. Richard straightened, his chest tightening. Yes. Finally. Who are you? She held his gaze, unflinching. Dr. Maya Ellis, Harvard Law, Stanford MBA, consultant to global firms, and, as of last week, the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of Halden Industries. The words struck harder than any blow. For a moment, the cabin seemed to exhale, as one. Gasps rippled like a wave. A man in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Someone else stifled a laugh of disbelief. Richard's face drained of color. What? His voice cracked, thin, almost childlike. That's impossible. I own Halden Industries. Her expression remained calm, almost gentle. You built it, yes. But companies change hands, Mr. Halden. Boards vote. Stockholders shift. And when the time comes for new leadership, old thrones collapse. The passengers watched, riveted. The mighty Richard Halden, undone not by force, but by a truth he could not deny. He shook his head, clinging to denial like a lifeline. No, this is some game, some sick trick. They'd never replace me. Her voice did not waver. They already have. The words fell with the finality of a gavel. Richard's assistant buried his face in his hands. The cabin seemed to lean away from Richard now, as though the very air rejected his arrogance. Richard's breath came ragged, his fists trembling against the armrest. You can't take what's mine." Maya tilted her head, her tone calm but edged with steel. "I didn't take it. You surrendered it. Every deal built on fear, every voice you silenced, every bridge you burned. This moment is the sum of them all. You gave it away long before I arrived." The silence of the passengers was no longer neutral. It was witness. It was judgment. Richard's laugh came out broken, wild, echoing against the dim cabin walls. "You think you'll last? You think they'll follow you? You don't know power. You don't know what it takes." Maya leaned closer, her words precise, deliberate. "Power is not measured by how loudly a man shouts in the dark. It is measured by the silence he leaves when no one listens anymore." The words cut through him like glass. He collapsed back into his seat, chest heaving, his empire slipping through his fingers even as he tried to clutch it. Passengers exchanged glances, some with awe at her composure, others with quiet satisfaction at his downfall. The flight attendant, returning down the aisle, paused to refill her water with a respectful nod. Richard saw it, the recognition, the respect, the dignity she commanded without demanding it. The very thing he had chased his whole life, she carried, effortlessly. His voice broke. Why humiliate me like this? Here? In front of them?" Maya's expression softened. "I didn't humiliate you, Mr. Halden. You did. I only let your words stand where everyone could see them. Truth has a way of speaking louder than arrogance." He closed his eyes, his face crumbling under the weight of it. The engines roared on, steady, indifferent to the fall of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Maya leaned back, her gaze returning to the endless night sky. "When morning comes, you'll land in a different world, Mr. Halden, one where your shadow no longer covers others. The question is, can you walk in the light?" The silence that followed was not empty, it was full of judgment, of revelation, of the quiet revolution that had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Richard Halden sat broken, no longer the king of the skies. And beside him, Dr. Maya Ellis, the woman he had mocked, belittled, dismissed, sat, not as a passenger but as the undeniable truth. The sky, vast and endless, belonged to her now,